So, what should we talk about today?
Well, I'm going to bat that back over to you, seeing as you've been watching loads of things lately
Yeah,
on YouTube and
yeah,
watching the world go around. I've been
yeah.
preoccupied with stuff, so
Okay, no worries. So, as you know, I've been invited to be part of a group of men who are looking at the idea of cognitive diversity and how it plays out, particularly in the boardroom. And one of the things that we're looking at is the idea that there are some inherent problems with the male psyche that lead to some, let's put it this way, maybe some unsavory behaviors in the workplace, maybe some biases that lead to uh, perhaps women not finding as much success in high level positions as you might expect them to. And there's lots of stats and, there's lots of this going on at the moment, lots of commentary on this at the moment. And there's all sorts of different perspectives, everyone's sort of chipping in on it. And it's, I think it's relevant because, when I think about clients that I'm working with, in some ways I'm not seeing it, but in other ways I am.
yeah, yeah,
And in some ways I'm seeing it in reverse. So I'm actually working with a client who has no male employees.
right, okay,
Yeah, and there's
different,
an acquaintance I've got, or a contact I've got, and she started a business, which also she doesn't run it anymore, but that also has no employees. It's got 30 employees, and none of them are men.
yeah,
So I think there's an interesting sort of thing here, and I don't know quite where it goes.
yeah.
Uh,
No,
uh,
I can relate to it straight away. I mean, immediately I was thinking about my kind of more corporate background,
mm,
and I don't think there was a female board presence in any of those businesses.
yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a government agenda to change this. So
Mhm.
there is a research program out there to support an initiative that I think the target is something like by 2030. The date might be wrong, but there's
Yeah,
definitely something there that any public company should have a minimum of 30% women on the board.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, we're not working at that level. Our clients
No,
are much smaller
exactly.
businesses than that, but I think there's still I still get to see I think there's still a belief that to be successful in business, you've got to be that sort of hard driving,
Yeah.
competitive, dominant sort of character.
Mm.
Um, Now, of course, there are women like that as well. So this is
Yeah, of
not like a
course.
male women thing. It's like,
Yeah.
of course, there are women
It's,
like that.
it's a human thing, isn't it?
It's a human thing. So I think the bigger question is this: do you have to be that way to actually have a successful business? Because when I watch programs like Dragon's Den or The Apprentice, they seem to propagate this idea that you've got to be that sort of person. And
Yeah,
the people that they have in the chairs, the judges, are those sorts of people, and they
they are.
demonstrate those sort of psychological profiles, really. And
Yeah.
but I'm very much less convinced that actually to be successful in business, you have to be that way. So I don't know what you think.
Yeah, for me, I think it's more closely aligned to starting a business than maintaining it.
Uh-huh.
In terms of that mindset, I think it's commonly portrayed that you have to have that within you to get going and get moving
Yeah.
and establish some traction. And it's kind of, it's a bit of a bum fight, um, you know, picture that they paint,
Mm.
where people have to have that in them to break away from whatever they're doing and go out and realize their vision.
Yeah.
Um, I think, if you start looking at things like Graves levels, that kind of fits in with that.
Do you want to
Whereas,
just explain a bit about what Graves levels
well,
are?
Tracy Graves looked at different levels of human development, and the premise of that is that we all go through all of those stages. There's no shortcut, and you can't jump in at stage 3. You have to go through the previous stages to get there. I know Graves has a red level, which is very much this dominant, go out, claim territory,
Yeah.
Put your flag in things, establish yourself, be prepared to roll your sleeves up and fight, duke it out over stuff.
Yeah.
And then obviously after that comes this natural sort of sense of order, and then how do you organize that chaos of scrambling for territory? That's in a business sense, obviously.
Yeah.
And then we start to then look at, well, what else do we bring in beyond organization and order and regulation, to move us further up those levels. So I think for me, it's very much linked to that mindset of, right, you need that to start off. You need that spark, that drive, that focus and dedication. But of course, now we have a wealth of technology at our disposal, which can do a lot of that stuff for you if you use it in the right way. And so
can take the place of that, like, aggressive drive to get.
I think so. Yeah, okay. I think so. And it's just down to people who have the vision and foresight to see it. So I do think there's a bit of a breakaway.
Yeah.
But I think very much our sort of social structure is set up to encourage that at every level. Right from childhood. You look at, because we're talking about this diversity within boards. You look at the toys that you buy children, or that are on offer to buy children.
Well, yeah.
You buy guns for boys, and you buy domestic appliances for girls, and that's what you're conditioned to do, and it kind of, that's the start of that process, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because potentially it's the start of that process, and I was having this conversation actually on Monday, and Tuesday, and I sort of, there's some research out there where psychologists have looked at this, and they've taken early age kids, who, as best as you can sort of define as not having been programmed with that sort of bias.
Yeah.
And what they've discovered is that boys migrate to what you might call boys' toys, and girls migrate to what you call girls' toys. And this seems to be an innate thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, the thing is, with that sort of experimentation, it's really difficult with humans, because it's like, how do you do that ethically? Because it's like, you can't, you can't take a newborn and raise them, and we'll
keep that kid in the basement for 6 years.
Yeah. You can't do it. So you can never, you're never starting with a truly blank sheet. And I think that's part of the problem with this. It's like, how do you really get underneath the skin of it?
But ultimately,
I think you can look at pointers.
Well, ultimately, it's role models, isn't it, as well, and what they're seeing going on around them. And my kind of, although I didn't see my dad as a kid go out with a gun or anything, sort of do the hunter-gatherer thing. He would go out, he would be out working, and my mum would be keeping the home, and ironing and doing things like that.
Yeah.
And so there is that from an early age, you're exposed to that immediately.
Yeah.
And therefore, you start to then attach.
Do you think that's still true? Do you think that's still true? I mean, I had that experience as well. That was very much the framework of my family growing up. Dad was the breadwinner, mum was the homemaker. And I definitely sort of felt that as a pull within me, when I got married and the kids, and we were sort of talking about, well, how do we raise the kids? It's like, and we were very lucky because I had a good job, and it's like we could make a choice. It wasn't like we needed two incomes, like we could have the lifestyle we wanted without both of us working. And that was a choice that ultimately was made. But it's like, to what extent is that a nature decision
versus nurture,
or a social pressure decision? Because my ex, who we're sort of talking about in this scenario, when she made that decision to really enjoy being a mum, I think that's the best way of doing it, the best way of describing it. Actually, she made the decision because she wanted to enjoy being a mum, and I wholeheartedly supported that. she came under a hell of a lot of pressure from other women. It's like, what are you doing? You're giving up your career, you know,
Yeah.
just take your maternity leave and go back to work and keep your career going. And it's like,
Yeah.
and it created a hell of a lot of turmoil in her. I can remember it clearly, you know, and it was not easy for her to make that decision.
No.
And so I think there's pressures in all sorts of directions here. I don't think this is like
Massively.
a unidimensional thing, and it's not a black and white, you know.
No, never.
You know, men are bad, men are the cause of this, you know, and equally it's not, you know, women are bad, women are the cause of this. It's just like this. I think this is a hugely complex area. And I think it's sort of bringing it back to this idea of, can you be successful in a business without, you know, having those, what you might call male driving characteristics. It sort of feeds from that idea that there is a social idea of what you have to be successful.
But of course, that's, you know, who has that been established by? You know, if you look at how long that's been the case in terms of that perception, you know, who's responsible for establishing that perception?
Well, I mean, this is going to like sound really like way up here, right? But it's like, honestly, I've been reading so much around this. I was even reading a piece around the cultural forces of leadership this morning. It's an academic piece that I found, and they trace it back to it's a Darwinian evolutionary process.
Survival of the fittest.
Well, actually, that's a misnomer. You do know that, yeah?
Well,
it's survival of those who can adapt the best. So his concept of fitness was your ability to adapt, not the strongest,
aggressive,
not the most aggressive. It was the ability to adapt, and I think that if you then sort of take this back to the idea of where did the current sort of frameworks of thinking around success come from, and that sort of aggressive dominance, that is still a major factor, certainly in a lot of, you know, you've only got to look at an industry like, you know, go into the world of finance and banking and commodity trading and things like that. You know, you cannot say that is anything but a macho dominant approach to that way. Doesn't mean that women aren't successful within it. It's the women who've got those sorts of characteristics, though, who become successful within that environment.
They can adapt.
Well, I don't know. Is it a question of adaptation, or is it a question of that's their nature? That's the way they were born. Were they born? Because there's, which sort of brings us back to that sort of guns for boys, prams for girls type thing. Is that really true? You know, I mean, I don't know.
I don't know. I think I looked at Bandura, and are you familiar with Bandura and his Bobo doll, with his Bobo doll experiment, looking at so he was like he's commonly known as the founder of social learning theory, which is a school of psychology. And they did this experiment with Bobo dolls, which is, you know, like a doll that you hit and it just pops back up. It's got weight at the bottom. And they looked at various role models, and it wasn't gender specific. It was just child's, you know, it was just children. And they had they let them watch videos before the experiment. So they had an adult person, you know, in real time punching this Bobo doll. So a group saw that. A group saw a cartoon or an animated version of sort of like a character punching the Bobo doll. And then the test group, the control group, saw nothing. Didn't see any video. And so all these kids were released into this room full of toys, and there was a Bobo doll in the room. And so it was testing the you know, the influence of, you know, role models, where we pull that from. And of course, the kids that didn't see anything still hit the Bobo doll. Because that's what you do with it. You know, sometimes you don't need instructions to you know, you can figure that stuff out. But by and large, they played with all the toys, you know, equally. The one that was the clear winner in terms of influence, where all the kids went in and absolutely hammered the Bobo doll, and, you know, was the ones who watched the animated version of it. And I sort of, I remember when I learned that, I was thinking, God, think of all the Tom and Jerry that I saw when I was a kid, and all the violence in Tom and Jerry. And that's probably more influential than watching an adult or a human do it.
And it's really interesting that you bring that up, because just the other day I was watching, I've been watching a series of lectures around psychology and the basic theories of psychology, and one of them was going into why we find it so easy to accept cartoons. And you know, if you think about the concept, it's a drawing of a cartoon figure of something that's not human, doing something that is human, and we have no problem with it. We just go, that makes sense.
I know.
And it's like, if you stop and analyze it, it's absolutely crazy. But it's like, well, why does that make sense? Why do we have no problem accepting something that is not human representing something that we know is human? And it's because it goes back to something I think we might have talked about. It's like, what we really live by is story and a narrative, you know, and so anything that carries the narrative that we can understand, we get past the image and we see the narrative. And I think that's a really interesting principle, because if that is the case, then we're picking narratives up from all over the place.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it also then turns on its head things like censorship with, you know, mainstream media, for example. So I look at my son. You know, he'll play Fortnite, which is basically him running around shooting people. But it's very cartoony. There's no violence outside of him obviously shooting people and hitting them with various pickaxes if he wants to. And that's perfectly acceptable. Everyone in his year group plays it. You know, they all play it online. And then you have something that's like Call of Duty, which is more realistic, same principle, same narrative. You're just seeing blood maybe, and that's deemed an 18. And yet the influential aspect of that isn't the blood. It's, as you say, the narrative and the shooting of people.
Yeah, but is it not the blood? Is it, because what you're transcending there is you're getting out of an abstract relation of a narrative, a story, through what could be described as innocent cartoons, to graphic depictions of what violence looks like. You know, because once you start showing blood being spilled or injuries or wounds, you know, that's a very different level of detail.
It is, but I'm linking it back to the, you know, good old Bandura and his Bobo doll. What was the influential factor on what you would call or consider aggressive behavior, punching this toy? It was the animated abstract. It wasn't the real one. So, you know, when we're talking about increase in violence and, you know, crime of that nature, no one's really looking at that stuff. They're all looking at the obvious stuff.
So how do we link this back to the idea of, you know, success in business, this sort of male psyche, you know, perhaps being disadvantageous to certain groups of people, or perhaps that you even have to conform to this male psyche to be success? I mean, how do we relate all that back?
Well, you know, I mean, I can relate that quite easily to the gaming side of things, because, you know, in order to win, you need to be more aggressive, more dominant, and you know, there's no surprise, you know, out of Harry's year group, should we say, it's probably one or two girls that play that. They're all predominantly boys, all, and it's encouraging that, you know, success for them in those terms is winning the game, being the last man standing. Actually, that's what the whole premise is, and it's by far and away the most popular game in the world now.
Is it? Oh, okay.
It's ridiculous, and they've you know, flipped the gaming model on its head as well, because it's free. You don't pay for it.
Okay.
And so, you know, their whole kind of premise of success is to beat everyone else, to win, to beat them down, to be aggressive, to be dominant. you know, their life lessons that they're experiencing. I mean, when you and I were younger, we didn't. I mean, my kind of early stage, probably when I was Harry's age, video game was a two lines and a ball bouncing around.
That was it. Same for me. Yeah.
Same narrative. I had to beat you,
Yeah.
but it's not quite the same as sort of going all out and.
Well, it's more sport, isn't it? You know, that's more
exactly. Exactly. But, so you know, these strands of that we're probably just, you know, it's games, it's escapism. They are subtly reinforcing that whole notion of, to be successful, you have to go out, you have to fight, you have to be dominant and claim your territory.
And I think you get that a lot in TV shows.
Yeah, everywhere.
And it is everywhere, and it's certainly in movies. You know, all massively. Sorts of movies. And so, can I pull this back and just say, okay, so those are the influences that are out there. You know, that's what's, you know, we're being flooded by this all the time. And in fact, the only place in which I do not see men being portrayed as quite aggressive is a lot of TV advertising. Not that I watch a lot of TV, but it's the only place where you see men being portrayed in some cases as the weaker sex, you know. And in fact, there was a couple of years ago, and it sort of went too far. There was a bit of a backlash to it in advertising, particularly white men were being portrayed as buffoons, or you know, weak idiots, or, you know, whatever description you want to put on it. And there was a bit of a backlash on that, and it's now moved into a much more balanced way. And, you know, you look at ads on TV now, and, you know, everything is balanced. You know, I was watching the other night. Anytime there's a family portrayed, it's a mixed race family. You know, you very rarely see single race families now portrayed in TV advertising. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. I don't want to comment on that. You know, it's like, they obviously feel that's the right thing to do through their research, etc., etc. But there's another message. You know, it's all part of the messaging received, isn't it? And it's like, you know, the earlier you receive that messaging, it becomes ingrained in you.
I mean, you know, you could argue that those sorts of adverts are promoting this sense of equality in every angle, you know, and we don't, sadly, you know, we've not evolved massively in that space as a race, and we should do. You know, immediately when you said about 30% as a minimum female sort of board presence, why isn't that 50? Why start at 30? And so I think in one sense you've got this idea that it's promoting that, and it's trying to promote acceptance of diversity. But obviously the skeptic in me says, well, they're just trying to sell something, so they're just trying to reach as many groups, target groups as possible. So it's disingenuous, you know.
Sure.
Which is ultimately, you know, you could wrap that up in it's just another tactic in being dominant.
Well, I think that's an interesting take, actually, because
we appeal to everyone. Who do you appeal to?
Yeah. That's very interesting. On that, sort of going back to that, you know, women presence on the boardroom, I was looking at some research. I think it was in the Financial Times a few years ago. They were looking at what's happened in the Scandinavian countries, because I think it's generally regarded that the Scandinavian countries have made the most progress in becoming egalitarian, you know, equal societies, you know, men and women, you know. And that hasn't resolved the issue of women being represented on their big companies in the Scandinavian companies. So even though they've taken away a lot of the sort of social issues around equality, it actually hasn't changed what's going on in business. And there's various sort of theories around that. And one of the theories is that, you know, men have a certain predilection towards certain interests, and women have a different predilection towards certain interests. And so if you look at where women in Scandinavia are migrating to in terms of their career choices, it does tend to be certain sort of industries, you know, and they can be very successful in those industries, but it leaves certain other industries underrepresented.
Yeah.
And of course, when you've got legislation which says, well, you've got to have a quota, and if you're not getting a flow through of the people you need for that quota, then you've got an inherent structural problem.
Yeah.
In exactly the same way that you've got a structural problem now. So
it just creates a different problem elsewhere, doesn't it?
It does. So
yeah, I was being particularly purposefully contentious with my 50% comment, just to see if you bit on that with because I know we've talked recently about this sort of outcome focus rather than the so I wondered whether you'd elaborate on that. But
yeah, well, thanks for dangling the bait, and I'm glad okay. I'm glad I didn't let you down. Well, I thought I grabbed it and went with it. So yeah, well, I mean, we're sort of, that's the thing about these sorts of conversations. It's so easy to diverge and sort of go, for it to balloon out into all sorts of areas. But I want to keep trying to keep it back into this idea of, do you have to be macho bullshit dominant to be successful in business, right?
No, you don't.
I mean, what's the evidence for that? Where is the evidence to say that you don't? I mean, are there companies that you can point to that say these are not macho bullshit companies and they are successful?
I think there are emerging companies. As I say, I think tech is a massive enabler now in terms of this tech presence. I think really where the challenge comes with a lot of these younger businesses, because it's these aren't going to establish overnight and change the world. That's the thing. You've got to look at the businesses that are emerging. I think it opens up a different dynamic or challenge where you've got people with an idea, and you go back to Dragon's Den. You've got people coming on with an idea, and they won't all necessarily have that dominant personality or set of characteristics, but they've got an idea that has legs, that has potential, and they're coming in. And we see this with business, when people go out for investment, the investors that they're attracting are the people that have established themselves by doing that. That's their natural position, if you like, and they're coming in and then injecting that into those businesses. So it's very difficult, I think, for whilst there are lots of opportunities and potential for businesses to emerge, and we are seeing them come through with tech. The moment they then start to attract or gain traction, they're then attracting people who are saying, well, actually, in order to get from this to this, you need to be like me. And that creates a different problem. And that's going to take a long, long time for those people that originally started those businesses to be in the same position as the dragons, if you like.
See, I think what you're talking about there is something that's really interesting, and that is who controls the money. Because again, I was having this conversation the other day. It was part of the same conversation I was having the other day. It's like, so I've got experience of being in a company that was funded by private equity, and it was all men. So all of the investors were men, and they were alpha males to the extreme, to the point where the strutting that used to go on in the meetings between these investors, like to try and show how influential, powerful, whatever word you want to put on it, was ridiculous. It's like they all had to have their phones to show how many deals they had going on at the same time, and the idea of turning your phone off and actually concentrating on the meeting that they were in was just like, forget that, because it didn't play to that theme of look how important I am. I've got all of these people wanting to talk to me, and it was laughable. I mean, I was literally sitting there laughable, and these people were like multi-millionaires, like and I thought, and I can remember thinking, if that's the game, actually I don't want to play that game, because it's ridiculous. It's like, who are they showing off to and why? But they had the money. That's the thing.
That's the thing, and you've hit the nail on the head where you've said that's the game they're playing, and that's the game of business historically that lots of people have to enter, and I'm an ex-basketball player. I couldn't step onto a football pitch and then pick the ball up and run to it, dribble it out the other end. You're confined to the rules of the game that you're playing, and those rules have been determined by that kind of behaviour, and then reinforced over God knows how long. And it's been set by men.
It has.
And so they're sort of unavoidable facts. So this whole notion of people who are opting out of that game are then trying to set up their own game, if you like, and attracting others. And that's the only way I think it's gonna change, is by having multiple games, and not just one.
And I think there's definitely signs of that, and I think I think you've hit on the seed of another force that's actually is creating change, and that is, and I never know the right term to use. It's like millennials or centennials, or whatever they So that generation that was born the late 90s, early 20s, so they're in their sort of mid 20s now. They're the ones, they're making their life choices, and they're in droves saying, I don't want to work for the big corporates.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to go through the same stuff that I saw my mum and dad go through. I don't want to live that sort of life. Added to which, I'll never be able to afford to buy a house, so I haven't got the same motivations to do it and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
And that, I think, more than anything else, is actually forcing a lot of corporates to reconsider how they're structured.
But
that's big business again.
It is, but equally, you've got lots of those that group who are sitting there going, actually, I don't need one job. I might have 2 part-time jobs. And that work around my lifestyle choices, or work around my priorities. And of course that was not that eventually that might become a mainstream thing, but it's that kind of approach to life, isn't it? I don't want to get caught up in this game.
Well, that's an option now, isn't it? I mean, we've had this debate around whether Amazon is a good company or a bad company, and it's a black, you love or hate Amazon. It's Marmite, isn't it? Right?
Everything is both good and bad.
But one thing you can't deny about Amazon is they have made it possible for people to become really successful and earn a lot of money by providing, I think this is part of the tech argument that you were sort of talking about. You look at the infrastructure they've created. You can sit in like we're doing, right? You can sit at home, you can source products from around the world, you can create an online shop, and if you are any good at building an audience and marketing and selling, you can create a very successful business using Amazon technology. And there's thousands of people around, if not millions of people around the world, who are doing that. And some are doing it as their mainline business, and some are doing it as a sideline to a corporate job, and others are doing various things with it. So I think you're absolutely right. There's that as another option. And of course, if you're running a smaller business, which is our sort of space, I guess, that sort of 10 to 100 employees, that sort of thing, it's like, how do you find good people? It's like, I've never met anybody. I mean, I've been in this space now for 10 years. You've been in it, I think, for a bit longer than me, right? I've never met anyone who said, it's really easy to recruit people. No one's ever said that to me.
No one's ever said that. No one ever says that. But it's also not, it's not just the good people, it's the right people as well. In terms of, having that, back to what we were saying earlier about that diversity of perspective in a business. That's what really grows a business. You can establish a business from a specific sort of skill set or approach, but what really grows and expands that business is the diversity side of it. And creating a way that blends together well and doesn't clash. Where people, because we typically view or judge people based on my strengths versus your strengths. They're not the same. So therefore you're inferior and I'm superior. And really we don't ever look at, these are my weaknesses and these are your strengths. And actually that fits together much better. But we always go like for like, and it creates clashes or it can
Yeah.
do.
But I think that takes us back to the sort of Darwinian thing, because, you know, from a point of nature, we are attracted to things and people, or, you know, things that are like us, we are attracted to, and things that are different to us, we are sort of a bit repelled from, you know. And whether that is a politically correct or acceptable thing to say, I have no idea, but it seems to be, it's certainly a natural thing. I mean, that's, you know, in nature, that's how things propagate in nature. It has been how humans have been, and we are fighting that tendency for like to migrate to like, and to separate from that which is not like us. And we've come a long way down that path.
We have,
but we've got a hell of a long way to go.
Oh, massively. And, you know, the more, for me, I think the more it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because a lot of our sort of obsession as a race is to label things, to identify things and say, well, you're this or you're that, based on X, Y, and Z. And of course, that does serve a purpose to an extent. But the more you do that, the more you create and reinforce division.
So I think there's an interesting question there, which is like, does difference have to create division?
Well, it doesn't, but it does, because of the way we use the system at the moment. So we encourage, you know, we're trying to create inclusion and diversity. And what we're doing is we're creating subgroups that people attach themselves to, which creates more further division.
So I think that's really interesting, because many years ago, I spent some time in the States, and I made the decision I didn't want to live there. Not because I don't like anything American, or, you know, it's not, I'm not anti-American or anything like that, you know, so, and it's an amazing place, you know, I always say to anyone who's never been, you got to go, you know, it's like, it's the most incredible place. However, and I'm talking back in the early 80s was when I was out there. I sensed this idea that you had to be part of a group. I remember we used to go, me and my friends I was with, you know, we go to different bars. You went to a cowboy bar, you went to a sports bar, you went to this type of bar, you know.
It's all about identity, isn't it?
And it was like, if you went into a cowboy bar and you weren't dressed as a cowboy, everyone looked at you. Now, having said that, it wasn't as bad as like a pub I went to in Cornwall or another pub I went to in Glasgow. And they heard me talk, right? And I don't think I've got a particularly posh accent or anything like that. But it's like they heard me talk and the whole pub went quiet and I had to leave. And in fact, that's happened to me in North Wales, right? In a pub I used to go to when I was a teenager.
So it keeps happening to you, basically. You keep being asked to leave pubs. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, that wasn't the narrative that I was trying to paint, but yeah. So, you know, it just sort of points to this idea of difference and divergence, and you know, can we accept difference as a positive? Or are we in a situation where difference creates these separate groups which cannot live together? Well, I think that's what America is.
And I think, you know, there are lots of purists attached to some of those groups where you can't be part of multiple groups because it's seen as, you know, you're disingenuous or not authentic, you know, member of one group or the other. I think there's a challenge around coexisting versus splitting the atom and saying, well, actually everyone's now got their place. There's a difference, and I think we're dangerously moving towards this place of splitting the atom and having lots of subgroups that people are in, that is just, you know, more division.
Yeah.
less diversification. If you step back, then yes, we've got a diverse society, but is that society integrating, and is it really an inclusive society? Well, no, it's not, because you've got to assign yourself to groups.
So what does that mean for running a business?
Well, I think, I mean, we look at that from a business perspective around culture and values, don't we? And saying this is who we are as a business. We try, businesses try and create a common set of values that, attract or repel certain individuals and people that, will either thrive within that environment and contribute towards it or won't. But it's at a very top level. It's not about we only accept cowboys, like line dancing or whatever. It's a real sweeping statement, but it's but it's we try and look at these values that define the personality of the business outside of or beyond character traits, like you can have a strong dominant character who can then coexist with a more sort of rational, logical character versus a nurturing character set. And so we try and create these bridges and say, well, this applies to humans. Come in and if you agree or subscribe to these values, then you can thrive in this organization, as long as you do your job, obviously. But I do think that we're outside of business. We've got lots of subgroups, and it creates division. And if you then take that division into the workplace from the outside, from the society perspective, if I go in and I don't know, at a very basic level, I'm a Tottenham fan, and I go in and have to work with an Arsenal fan, then you've got other. I mean, that's again sweeping, because I've got lots of friends who are Arsenal fans. But if you then if you've got societal pressure to align yourself to something and be fiercely loyal to that cause or whatever that group is, and then you're dropped in an environment where you're the only one, creates pressures, creates difficulties integrating, being collaborative. And so this is the dynamic, isn't it? You've got business actually trying to do this from a value perspective. Don't always work, and they're not always true to it, we know. But outside of business, you've got society completely breaking people down into little silos and little subgroups, and it causes problems.
I don't know whether I agree with what you just said, actually. It's quite, I mean, that was a very big statement, society breaking people down into subgroups. I mean, surely people choose to go into subgroups.
But they do choose, but it's these subgroups are set up very quickly, aren't they? Established very quickly. And then I'm not saying all subgroups, I'm just saying that certain groups that we're seeing emerge, and we've talked about this before, certain groups that we see emerge then kind of start to adapt and take on the same behavioral traits the things that they're very much opposed to.
Absolutely. Which is interesting, because
and
what that is then
I'm talking about.
Yeah. So and that's really interesting, because what you're then talking about is there a natural way in which people have to organize themselves for a group to be successful? Which sort of circles us back to
exactly the same thing. And it's that dominance, isn't it?
I think there was if I remember right, there was a really successful book. I think it was called something like The Tipping Point. I can't remember now. Or a couple of American psychologists, they looked at various different businesses, and one of the models they looked at was the drugs cartels. And when they actually got into the drugs cartels and actually analyzed the structure, it was no different to a big multinational corporation. It was exactly the same. And the pressures that applied at each level within the organization were exactly the same. So the psychological issues you find at the lower levels of a big public multinational company were exactly the same as the psychological problems you found at the lower end of a drugs cartel. It was like it was a fascinating book. I'll have to
have to look that out.
Look it up and get the right title and get the names. But
yeah,
so I think it does speak to the idea that there are certain ways in which, if you're going to organize as a group,
and get traction. That's what it's about, isn't it? It's about getting traction.
Yeah. So I was looking at something interesting. I know I keep saying it the other day, but it's the other day. I was looking at something. I think that's what sort of prompts the conversations, you know.
Yeah.
And it was a video around flat organizations, and it was trying to give examples of where companies, people setting up businesses, have tried to break out of the hierarchical structure. And I think the interesting thing was there wasn't a load of examples.
No.
Two, some of the examples he gave were really stretching the definition of flat.
Yeah.
So when you actually really honed in, there was maybe 3 or 4 examples where you could say, yeah, this is a genuinely flat structure.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. So I think it's clearly possible. And I know there's a very famous Brazilian guy, and the name is slipping me at the moment, who actually did this, and he built a company. I think he got it up to about 300 people. And it was a self-managing company. There was, no chief exec and, no board or anything like that. It really was self-managing. And it had success for a while, but it got to a certain level and it didn't.
Plateaued.
It seemed to reach the level at which it could be successful.
It's only so far you could take it.
So it seems to that we, whichever way we try and break out of this pattern, it seems to come back. So is there a way of answering this question, really sort of breaking out that, to be successful, if you're going to run a business, you've got to have a preponderance of those male type characteristics of competitiveness, dominance, almost aggressiveness? I mean, does it always circle back to that?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you've just again, you touched on something there around competitiveness. By default, any business that comes in is going to have competition, and by its very definition of competition, it's a clash of some sort, isn't it? It's a conflict that needs to be resolved in some way. So therefore, in order to do that, do you need those skills in order to overcome that? Is it always at the expense of? Success is always at the expense of.
But are those male qualities? Because you look at the Olympics, and there's as many female competitors in the Olympics.
Think they're male. No, I don't think they're male qualities.
Right. So what's happening? What's going on?
Well, I personally think that those qualities are amplified or promoted in men and suppressed in women. Historically, I think that's what's happened. And at the moment, we're going through a period where actually it's becoming more acceptable for women to exhibit those qualities and use those qualities, whereas it wasn't before.
So why can't we turn it around the other way? Why can't we say, why isn't it becoming more acceptable for men to exhibit those female qualities which are invaluable? Right? So, female qualities, and I'm sure there's a lot of people will possibly be offended by this idea that you could have male qualities, female, or that you would choose to define them in that way. But, I've read lots of literature around this, and, it's sort of embedded in a lot of social sort of commentary. You think of Mother Nature, Father Time, that sort of, that language is in there, right? So whether it's right or wrong, so there are certain characteristics which are defined as being more male and more female. So more female characteristics tend to be things like caring, nurturing, creativity. I mean, that's why it's Mother Nature, because you're bringing life into the world, right? You know, that's what the feminine thing, isn't it? But surely that's what a business is about. You are bringing something into the world. It's a birth process. And yet, you know, yes, there's lots of women now doing that. But when you get into running a business, it still seems to be what you might define as the male qualities that seem to be looked for by the people who are looking for other people to run businesses. And I think that's a real quandary.
It is, because it's a rigged game, isn't it, at the moment?
Is it rigged? But that's it. Is it rigged, or is it just...
Well, it's just defined in that way, isn't it? The game is defined in that way. And in order to really make change, you need to change the game. There's no point just changing the players. You need to change the game you're all playing.
So how do you do that?
Well, it's a massive ask, isn't it? It's a massive ask, because you have to unpick hundreds of years of perpetuating that one game.
But could I start a business today? Could you start a business today and start it from a different basis of rules?
I think anyone can. It's just whether they can make that business as successful as they want to. Because there's always going to hit a point where they're going to go up against someone else who's going to be approaching it from that perspective, the dominant perspective. And so that's the challenge. You know, it's like dropping a goldfish in a pool with sharks.
Okay.
And saying, right, how do you survive? Not just survive, but how do you thrive?
So I think that's a really great question. It's like, so if I've got this vision that I want to create a business that it doesn't conform to, you know, the accepted wisdom. And I've got to go out there and I do have to compete in this world. So the very fact you use the word compete, you're already starting to, you know.
It's the language, isn't it?
It's the language.
Who are your competitors?
So let's change the language. Say, I want to survive and thrive in this world, but I'm up against people who might want to actually do me in. How do I maintain my values, my approach, and be successful without falling prey and slipping into their way of doing things? How do I do that?
It's a massive challenge, isn't it? It's a massive challenge. And the only way you can do that really is by appealing to people that share your values, you know, appealing to your peer group, and bringing people in that align to that resonates with, both from a buying perspective and both from a collaboration perspective as well. And that's the only way you can do it. And
I think that's what the tech allows us to do now.
It does. It allows us to reach those people.
You can put your message out there, a bit like we're doing. We're putting our message out there in our way. It will resonate with some people. I'm sure it will have been offensive to other people, but you know, I always like the old Eleanor Roosevelt quote is, you can't be offended. Nobody can offend you without your permission. You know? So it's like, you know, exactly. Being offended is a choice, you know. It's
exactly.
So okay, so I think we're sort of saying you can build a business, but it's difficult.
It's difficult. It is difficult because you're playing in a game that's, you know, set towards that recognizes a certain type of behavior. And yes, you've got, you know, millennials, centennials breaking out and changing that and disrupting it. I wouldn't say they're necessarily changing it, but they're disrupting it. And the more we can disrupt that, the more diversity we have, and the more homes we have for people to go to within those businesses that don't want to work like that. You know, that can coexist with competitors, because you're never going to beat out the competition. There's always going to be competition.
Well, and there's an argument to say you don't want to, because the most successful markets have the most competitors in them, you know.
Exactly. And
so they always say don't start a business where there's no competitors, you know. So.
So So that's kind of the only. It's slow. It's slow progress, isn't it? It's not going to happen overnight.
Well, it's evolution.
It is, but we've got to adapt.
That's it. So Darwin was right.
He was. You've got to adapt.
Fantastic. I think we've done it.
Yeah.
Well, when I say we've done it, we've come back in a circle.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't answered it, but we've covered it.
Cool.